The subject of this series of videos is capitalism, and the question that we're going to explore is its morality. Is capitalism a good thing or a bad thing? Is it, as some have claimed, just a tool that rich people use to hoard all of the wealth in a society? Or is it a way of lifting people out of poverty and rewarding the hard work that they do? Let's look at it from both sides and see what we can learn. To begin with, we need some sort of a standard as to what we mean by morality. There are lots of options to choose from, but in Western culture, the most influential ideas about morality originated with a man named Jesus from Nazareth. So we'll begin by taking a look at what Jesus might have thought of capitalism. Let's begin in the New Testament, where we read a story in which Jesus encounters a rich young ruler. At the end of this story, Jesus says,
"I tell you the truth. It is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven."
Today, many Christians aren't quite sure what to make of this quote. They get the idea that Jesus was all about helping the poor and loving your neighbor, but why didn't he like rich people? After all, aren't rich people the ones who can most afford to be generous? Aren't they the ones who are in the best position to help the poor? This story of his encounter with a young rich man shows up in 3 of the 4 Gospels. But what does it mean? Is Jesus really saying that it's wrong to have riches or even to have nice things? Well, the answer is a little bit complicated, so we're going to try explaining it the way Jesus would have done, with a story. Once, there were 4 brothers. Let's call them Mo, Larry, Curly, and Shemp. Like most young men, they were ambitious, eager to get on with their lives and begin making money for themselves. To aid in this, their father gave each of them a flock of 3 sheep. Now, one of these brothers, Mo, was far more ambitious than the other 3, and he realized that he could increase the size of his flock by stealing one of the sheep that belonged to his brother, Larry. Thus, Mo had 4 sheep, while his brother Larry now had only 2. Since this little scheme had worked so well, Mo decided to try it again and steal one of Curly's sheep. With 5 sheep to his name, Mo was now considered to be pretty well off, while his brothers, Curly and Larry, were thought to be poor, since they only had 2 sheep each. And so, Mo continued stealing sheep from his brothers until he became the richest man in town, and everybody else was barely scraping by. Now, this story is important because in ancient times, this is how people became rich. The only way for a person to get more riches was to take them away from somebody else. So rich men got richer by stealing from others and making them poor. That's why Jesus said, it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. This method of making money is what some people call a zero-sum game. In a zero-sum game, there's only one way to get more wealth. You take it away from somebody else. It's kind of like slicing a cake at a birthday party. If you cut an extra large slice for yourself, there's going to be less cake for everybody else. Of course, earning a living doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. Even in biblical times, there were other ways to earn a living. Watch closely and see if you can figure out how Larry, Curly, and Shemp are able to become just as wealthy as Mo is without stealing anything. Currently, Mo owns 6 sheep. That's half of the wealth in the whole village, making him the richest guy in town. In fact, he's so rich that he decides to hire a shepherd boy to take care of his flock for him and take a little vacation. and while he's gone, his brothers go to work raising more sheep. Before long, the flocks that belonged to Larry, Curly, and Shemp had all had babies, while Mo's sheep did very little more than sit around eating the grass and getting fat. When Mo got back from his vacation, he found that his brothers now owned 6 sheep each, for a total of 24. When Mo left for his vacation, there had only been 12 sheep in the whole village. Now, there were twice that many. The total amount of wealth in the community had significantly increased. Mo's brothers had gotten just as rich as he was without having to steal anything from anybody, and the secret of their success was working hard and turning their labor into wealth. Labor is what makes an agrarian economy work, and in biblical times, things like sheep herding were really the only game in town. But if you wanted to improve people's lives by growing the economy, you only had 2 options. A shepherd could make the economy grow by raising more sheep, as we've seen. Or he could grow the economy by raising more children who would grow up to be shepherds. And as long as they worked hard, the economy would grow because more people meant more labor. Now, there was only one problem with this system. More shepherds and more sheep created a need for more wealth because there were more mouths to feed. So even if there was more wealth to go around, everybody's share of that wealth was just the same as it had been before. So making the economy bigger didn't make people's lives any better. For centuries, wise men tried to figure out a way to increase the size of an economy without having to increase the number of people in it. And many centuries after Jesus' life, they finally succeeded. To see what they came up with, let's revisit Mo and his 3 brothers. Mo had learned that labor was a good source of wealth. Now, Mo still wanted to get rich, but he wasn't willing to get there by raising sheep the way his brothers had done. So one day, he talked his brothers into selling all of the sheep and trying out a new way of making money. Mo built a shoe factory. After all, he reasoned, everybody needs shoes, and it turned out he was right. The more shoes his factory made, the more people bought them. And pretty soon, Mo was making a whole lot of money. The demand for his shoes was so great that he had to hire people to help in his factory. And so his brother Curly went to work in the shoe factory. Soon, the company had doubled its output, and Mo was making even more money. And when Curly got home from the factory carrying a fat paycheck, his brothers wanted to know where he got the money from. When Curly explained that he had earned it working in his brother's factory, Larry and Shemp promptly left to investigate. And before long, all of the brothers had earned plenty of money, although Mo had a little bit more, since he was the owner of the factory. All 4 brothers had been able to make more money without having to steal it from anybody else. Mo's factory had literally increased the amount of money that existed in the community. In fact, if you think of the total amount of money as a kind of a pie, well, this pie had just gotten larger. Economists call this growing the economy, and the system that creates this growth is called capitalism. Most historians agree that capitalism has only been around since sometime in the 16th century. That means that when Jesus talked about rich men, camels, and the eye of a needle, well, he wasn't talking about men who became rich through capitalism, because capitalism hadn't even been invented yet. But suppose it had existed in Jesus' time. Do you think he would have approved of it? Well, to answer that question, we need to be very precise about what the word means and how it works. Capitalism is an economic system in which nations are able to grow their economies, creating more wealth for everybody. In a capitalist economy, anybody who wants to get rich can do so by building a business, and other people can earn a living by working in those businesses. This creates economic growth, and everybody can benefit from it. In fact, capitalist economies have been shown to be one of the most effective tools ever found for fighting poverty. All over the world, during the last 200 years, the number of people living in extreme poverty has plummeted, and many people believe that this means capitalism is the solution to world poverty. Because with capitalism, everybody seems to get a share of the wealth. As a result, many people today talk about capitalism as if it were much more than an economic system. They think of it as something Jesus would have approved of, a force for justice, and even morality. This has led fans of capitalism to make some pretty astonishing statements. Greed, they say, used to be a bad thing, but with capitalism, we've been able to put a harness on greed in the same way you'd put a harness on a horse. And as a result, the proponents of capitalism began to say things like this.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works.
Now, that's a pretty nice slogan, but is there any truth to it? Has capitalism really transformed greed into a good thing? I mean, is greed something that we should teach our children? Well, before we start teaching greed in elementary school, let's take a closer look at how capitalism sometimes works in the real world. Now, we've seen that in capitalist systems, when the economy grows, everybody makes money, although the people who own the businesses usually make a little bit more. But sometimes rich people get greedy. They say to themselves, well, I'm the one who created all that growth with my factory. Shouldn't I be the one to benefit from it? And so they begin to look for ways to take all the additional wealth that was created in the growth of the economy and keep that money for themselves. So we've seen that capitalism can be, and often has been, an enormously effective tool for generating wealth, fighting poverty, and building an economic middle class. But it's also a tool that has few, if any, safeguards to prevent it from being misused. So you'll want to join us for part 2 of this video series, in which we're going to take a look at specific examples of how some societies have been able to manipulate the way that capitalism works so that the wealth it generates winds up in the pockets of a very small number of people. See you then.